Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our QH webinar. So today we will have our very own postdoc fellow, Dr. Ziang Liu, to introduce his very new study titled Secular Decline in Modern China, which evidence from hydraulic constructions and rural carrier work in Suzhou and Shanghai. So as you know, Ziang received his PhD from LSE, London School of Economics, Economic History Department. So after his introduction, we are very happy to invite Professor Peng Kaixiang from Wuhan University as our discussant. So for the audience, as before, please leave your question in the Q&A box, and after the discussion, we will review your questions and let Dr. Ziang to answer. Yeah, so Ziang, it's your time.
Thank you very much, Zhishan, and hopefully I'll be, a titled professor in some years' time. Okay,
yes,
so let me
that's
just.
What I mean.
So let me just share my screen. So yeah, I hope this is working now. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Zhishan, for the lovely introduction. And so for today's talk, I will be introducing you my latest research on, again, another white paper about Chinese economy. So before we move on, let me firstly give you a general outline about what we'll be talking about today. So today's presentation will be consisting of 3 sessions. In the first session, I will briefly go through some of the theoretical works and debates which motivated this paper to come out. And then in the second part, I will explain some details about the case we're looking at, which is the hydraulic constructions in the Lower Yangzi region. So in this session, I will firstly talk about where this labor came from, and then secondly, I will go through some details about how their wages were settled and how their wages were formed. And in the last part, perhaps this is the most important part and an interesting part to some of the audience here. It's about whether we find any wages evidence to support this so-called secular decline thesis, which has been argued by some China experts from the past decades or so. So yeah, let me move on to the first part, research framework. So in this part, what I would like to talk about is the classic debates for modern Chinese economy, which is whether the Chinese modern economy was still in an evolutionary path or began to show the signs of more intensive growth. And so, for the audience here, you are probably already very familiar with the historical and time backgrounds for the Chinese economy and society during this period of time, which is a time of dynastic decline, political instability, and social changes. And for this period, if you look closely at the Chinese economy, 2 keywords often appeared in the literature. One is rural sector. So the reason why it is one of the most important keywords here is because the Chinese rural sector was still central to the debates on the economy during this period of time, and also agriculture was still the dominant sector in China's economic structure. And lastly, if you look at urbanization or many other indicators, the majority of Chinese population is still rural, right? But for that part, later on we'll have another discussion, so I will just leave it here. The second keyword, as we have already mentioned, is population, which has been a very common attribute to China's economic downturn ever since the early modern time until the modern time. And the debate here is about whether the growing population in China from the Ming to Qing and to the Republic period was just population pressure, or can be termed as Malthusian trap. So for the first stream of thought, which originally comes from Philip Horn's argument on evolution, there have been some debates in the literature arguing that the Chinese economy was trapped in this so-called evolutionary path, which means an ever-increasing labor input on land results in diminished returns per unit of labor. And from recent years, we do find sort of evidence to support this evolutionary path. For example, if you look at the decline in yield output in the agricultural sector, or even GDP per capita for the Chinese economy covering this entire period, you would find, this declining evidence to support this evolution thesis. But in the very contrast, we also have these arguments saying that the Chinese economy was already experiencing the onset of modern growth, at least by the early 20th century. And there were many supports. Again, there were many supports behind these arguments. For example, population and demographic historians would argue that at least the population pressure in the Lower Yangzi region was alleviated following the end of the Taiping Rebellion, which in the region the population may have not recovered to its pre-war level by the early 20th centuries. And also, either some classic or recent studies on local economy in Manchuria and the Lower Yangzi Delta also shows some evidence of the beginning of intensive growth in the modern sector, which have been argued to have spillover effects over the traditional sectors. So, we can't really deny that the very nature of Chinese agricultural sector is still petty peasant economy and labor-intensive farming. But the question here is, to what extent did this labor-intensive farming feature inhibit the transfer of labor between agricultural and non-agricultural activities in modern China? So that's the question we're going to further explore in the next part. So speaking of that, let's have a look at the working patterns of Chinese rural labor in the modern times. So again, if you believe in the evolution hypothesis, the very underlying assumption behind it is that it is a combination of overpopulation and limited working opportunity outside of agricultural sector, which resulted in an increasing deployment of labor in agriculture. And in other words, there was a very little labor movement between sectors, right? But the problem is, if there's surplus labor in the rural sector that continue to be absorbed by the land, these would impact not only labor returns from agriculture, but also from non-agricultural activities. So speaking of labor movements and the transfer between and within sectors, we can generally characterize these in two parts. One is the labor transfer within the sector. This often appeared in classical studies on China's agriculture, especially in the Lower Yangzi region. For example, previous scholarships have talked a lot about the transition between a labor transition between agricultural activities and agricultural activities, such as and even family textile productions. And regarding labor transfers between sectors, the very first thing came out in our minds is perhaps labor redeployment during the time of quick industrialization. And this is the case in countries like Britain and Japan, where quick industrialization have created a new job and working opportunities in the secondary and tertiary sectors, which eventually attract labor from the first sector to the next two sectors. But if you look closely at the Chinese case, there have also been seasonal labor transfers between sectors. And what I mean is the labor shift in activities during harvest season and off seasons. So that means even if the majority of the Chinese population is still rural in the modern times, it doesn't necessarily mean that all rural population were farmers. That's a very big distinction, an important distinction here we have to take care of. So the reason why I was saying not all Chinese rural population were farmers is because we do have evidence of that. So the first piece of evidence came from the from farmers and peasants' frequent involvement in casual work. For example, if we look at the very classic surveys conducted by John Lusenbach, the survey result shows that casual work and non-farming incomes were actually prevalent for Chinese rural laborers. And even by the time of 1997, when the current government completed the first national consensus of agriculture on the very rapid change towards market economy, there was still a significant amount of rural populace engaged in both farming and non-farming activities. So these tables summarizes what I've just mentioned about the survey result from Ziang Liu and Bach, where you can see either in places that still remained agricultural by the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, such as Jiaxing, Deqing, and Yuyao, or places that have been quickly industrialized, such as Wuxi and Changshu. You can see, if you look at the third column here, there has already been a significant portion of rural labor engaged in both farming and non-farming works by this time, and that includes both male and female labor as well as child labor. And if you look just look at the portion of adult male labor engaged in both farming and non-farming activities, this percentage was even higher. And the second reason I would argue that not all Chinese rural populace were farmers is the evidence from the length of the working year. So, typically speaking, the agricultural working year in the double cropping regions in the Lower Yangzi Delta is typically around 180 days per year. But in fact, if you again look at the survey results of the length of working year from Bach's survey, it shows that during this period of time, Chinese peasants in the Lower Yangtze worked around 330 days per year, which is nearly doubled than the agricultural working year. So here's again another summaries of Bach's survey result, from which you can see that that the idle time occurred mostly in the winter seasons, and in other times of the year, there were very little idle times for the Chinese farmers, which means here the importance of the rural casual work in our current studies are often overlooked. This can be seen from two parts. One is the percentage of labor employed in subsidiary works, which is Bach's own terms, or in my terms, in non-farming activities, and also the evidence from the length of working year, which have shown that there were roughly 5 months for the Chinese peasant to engage in non-farming activities in the rice and wheat double cropping areas. So now we understand that casual work is frequent and prevalent, at least in the Lower Yangtze Delta in modern China. Now the question is whether we can, explore the local economy from these casual works, and particularly the wage incomes from these casual work. So for people who are looking to wages and labor in modern China, you probably have already aware that wage data in modern China was scarce, very little. So for data on the rural sector or rural wage incomes, there were two types of survey data. One comes from the nationwide surveys by we have mentioned Ziang Liu and Bach during the 1920s and 30s during his stay at the Nanjing University. And the other set of data came from the Japanese Manchukuo, but which is mostly taken in the northeastern part of China, which is Manchuria or Dongsanshan in Chinese. And these surveys are mostly conducted after the 1930s under the Japanese colonial rule. Other than that, we still have to notice that even if we have wage evidence from casual work, these wages might be significantly higher than the average market level. So recent year studies on the construction industries in Europe have already shown to us that casual work employment is often shortening the time of employment, but in return, these workers receive higher wage pays. And in the Chinese case, one of the examples we can see as a type of casual work is day farm activities during harvest seasons. These data are occasionally available, but like we said, they can be as high as skilled workers employed in urban areas. So that means they cannot represent the typical wage income levels, as seasonal farm day wages include both a premium for short-term employment and a seasonal rise in labor demand and prices. So now the question is, what about hydraulic construction wages. And here's a graph showing you the very dense network of waterways in the Lower Yangzi Delta, and especially in the northern part of the delta, which includes Zhenjiang, Changzhou, Suzhou, Taicang, and Songjiang. And these regions, and it shows that we would be able to have abundant of case records from the hydraulic constructions, and especially on the workers' wages. And here is another figure which shows you the frequency of these hydraulic construction projects every year between 1820 and 1911. So you can see these are not rare cases. Actually, they are very frequent in the region. And if we further look at the frequency by month, you can see the most majority of these projects actually started in the agricultural off-seasons, which happened roughly after September and then stopped after February or March. So from this graph, you can see, the commencement of these local hydraulic construction projects is actually showing a reverse relation to the agricultural activities, in which during the plowing and harvest seasons, there were very little construction works carried out, but during the off seasons, they began to appear in records. So to summarize, in this paper, we will be looking at rural labor employed in government-led hydraulic constructions in the Lower Yangzi course. So by the term government-led, it doesn't necessarily mean they're all organized by the government. They can also be endorsed by or supported by the government. And these projects were usually carried out by rural laborers and typically last around 1 to 3 months in time. And like we have already seen, they were mostly employed in the winter seasons. And from these cases, we are able to collect and organize data on labor sources, on how these labor were organized on site and how their wages were settled over the time. So eventually, we hope to draw some further implications and observations on the local economy from these wage evidence. Okay, so let's move on to the second part of this talk, which is about some details on the hydraulic constructions in the Lower Yangzi Delta. Right, so for the first part, I would like to talk through how these laborers, rural laborers, were mobilized under the state administrative systems and with the help of local gentries. So on the construction site, we can roughly group different workers into these categories. So the first and the most important type of worker cohort is digger or earth digger. They were the single largest cohort on construction sites, and it usually ranged from dozens to tens of thousands of people. They were responsible for simply speaking, digging the earth and transporting them to the designated sites. And they may also undertake other tasks such as piling and ramming, although in records they were often referred by different job titles. And other than diggers, we also found the so-called water pump operators, but they were usually small in numbers and very often subcontracted to other service providers, which is not directly organized by the government or the gentries. And other than that, we also found certain craftsmen, but they were usually employed for specific tasks such as bridge or stone embankment constructions. And again, they were small in numbers and records. And lastly, we also found dredger and marship workers. These workers were, in essence, the same as diggers, but they were rather semi-skilled workers with the introduction of dredger and marships by the early 20th century. So before the early 20th century, we hardly find any records and evidence on these cohort of workers. And since diggers were the most important part of this study, let's have a further look of their labor sources. So for diggers, simply speaking, they were a historical legacy from the state's COVID system. So that's why in records, you would often see these diggers were referred to as the so-called registered labor, or sometimes tenant farming labor. Other than that, you will also be able to find the so-called hired labor, which I will later on explain to you. Over the time, they literally became the same type of labor and they only differ in name. And other than these two sources, some rural laborers were actually organized by contractors, and the last form is levied labor, which appeared in records after 1927, when the Kuomintang KMT began its north expeditions. So, like we said, registered labor were actually a legacy of the COVID system. And simply speaking, these labor were registered by the government on certain accounts and registries. And whenever there were a project carried out, the government would issue a quota of labor to the village, which often to the hands of gentries and elites. And then in turn, these local elites would help the government to fulfill these labor quotas. But even that was the case, 19th century actually witnessed a sea change in the organization of these registered labor. Simply speaking, these labor gradually became the same as hired labor, as they were both paid wages and organized under market principles. So it all started with increasingly frequent transactions in land ownership. So, like we said, because these labor were registered on the government's account based on their land properties, and then the increasingly frequent change in land ownership in the region has caused a lot of difficulties for the government to actually assign and designate these core tasks to the household registered account. And if you look at the details in records, many of them would refer the 1827 Wusun River project as a watershed, because it set up a precedent where all following inter-regional projects should exclusively use hired labor instead of registered labor. And then eventually, after the end of the Taiping Rebellion, registered labor in many records have been explicitly explained as practically the same as hired labor. So that is about the rules of state and gentries in the mobilization of these construction workers. So now, let me explain to you why, even if these labor were largely organized under the state's administrative systems, their wages were determined by the market mechanism. So usually when a project began, the government or the officials will take a reference of the wage standard paid in the precedents, and then these precedents were served as a reference for negotiation between the official in charge of the project and the local gentries who were in charge of labor mobilization. So, for example, in the 1872 Qipu River project, the initial pay standard was set as the same as in 1816 project, but then was considered too low and eventually increased. And other than taking a reference to the precedent, you would imagine that the price, especially rice price, played a very crucial role in the wage setting process. So generally speaking, rice was a general reference for wage standard. For example, in the 1871 and 72 Wusun River project, officials initially considered lowering wages as rice prices had more than halved compared to the case in 1863, when the maintenance work were lastly undertaken. But eventually, considering the shorter daylight in the winter seasons and the difficulties of this project, the wage standard will remain the same instead of lowering down. And other than typical price movements on the market, any temporary price surge on the market, especially the local markets, would also cause wage to be adjusted. One example is the 1915 Liu River project, where the wages were eventually increased by 25% due to the surge in prices as workers gathered on construction sites. So other than prices, seasonal labor supply and demand also played a very big role in the process of wage setting. So As we have already seen at the very beginning of this presentation, projects usually commenced in the agricultural off-seasons to avoid labor shortage. But in many cases, even if the government try to avoid labor shortage, they still can't compete with the income incentives from the agricultural activities. Well, one example is again the 1871 Wusong River project, in which case Nanhui County had issues in mobilizing laborers due to the start of the plowing season. And consequently, the government had to recruit workers from Shanghai as a supplement of their given quota of laborers. Another example comes from the 1890 Li Jiabong project, in which case the government again had difficulties in mobilizing these laborers, even if with wage incentives. So what it did is to request army's assistance to complete the projects. And then another example comes from 1904 Zhutaipu project in Shanghai, which the project itself already started in October to avoid labor shortage. But then because of the start of the plowing season in March in the next year, the project was completely halted and only resumed in October of the next year. And other than price, other than seasonal labor supply and demand, when you talk about wage setting mechanisms, you would obviously think about strikes as a way of negotiation for wages. So in records, I often find that workers may strike if they perceive the wages to be too low. One example is the 1899 Liu River project, in which case the government raised the wages as workers spoke. Another case, other than these, normal typical strikes, if workers found out there were wage differentials between different construction sites that were taking place at the same time, that may also trigger a strike. One example is the 1877 Chile Bridge Canal project, in which case over 1,300 workers went on strike after discovering that their wages were actually lower than those of an earlier project in the same region. And lastly, if workers don't strike, they can also simply run away from the construction sites, causing problems to the government. And one of the examples comes from the 1914 Wujing Market River project. So that is about the wage setting mechanisms. So another set of evidence which can tell you why these workers were actually mobilized under market principle is by looking at their wage formation. So we can have a look of workers' remunerations from the following three categories. One is obviously their wage pays, which are mostly in piece rates and occasionally in day rates or workday rates. And other than their normal wage payments, these workers also received certain allowances. And lastly, these workers may also receive other allowances such as traveling costs or holiday rewards or the completion rewards when the project was completed. So regarding their wages, like we said, is mostly piece rates and occasionally day or workday rates. And these piece rates were determined by, firstly, soil conditions, because different soil conditions have different working efficiencies, as these wages were in piece rates. And other than soil condition, the length of daylight also may affect the pay standard, because in winter times, the typical working hours for these construction workers were around 7 to 8 hours per day, which excludes the lunch break. And then in summer times, these working hours can be longer, ranging from 10 to 12 hours. And regarding how these wages were paid, from the records available, government projects were usually issued wages in 5 installments. So 20% of the wages will be issued at 20% of completion, 50% of completion, 70%, and then 90%. And then the final installments will be issued after the official inspection and acceptance of the project. So from these arrangements, you can already see that when the government was setting the wages for these construction workers, they have considered many market elements there. And other than the wages, there were also allowances. So one type of allowances is the so-called shared allowances, which is a one-off housing allowances, either provided in building materials or cash to the workers. And other than that, we also managed to find the so-called food allowances for work interruption. This typically happened during the time when the construction work was interrupted and stopped by heavy rain or snowing. The reason why in records that the government issued these food allowances is to keep workers on site. Again, during the time when works have nothing to do on the construction site, there will be no piece wage issued to the workers. So that's why the government, in order to avoid workers simply run away from the site, they have to issue these food allowances, which is typically about 1/3 of workers' daily wages. So here is another table which summarizes some of the records we managed to find from many sources, in which you can see these food allowances was about 1/3 of workers' daily wages. So the conclusion I would like to draw from here is that from either how these workers were mobilized through the local administrative system or how their wages were settled and their wages were formed, we can argue that since at least the 19th century, a casual work market has formed in the Lower Yangzi Delta, which allowed rural laborers to switch between agricultural and non-agricultural activities based on wage incentives. So in other words, even if this system was originated from the COVID system, but by the 19th century at least, there have been a very strong market incentives formed in this industry. So let me move on to the last part of the talk today, which I think I may have talked too fast. So but also means we still have a lot of time to, thoroughly talk about the last part, which is whether the Chinese economy was experiencing a secular decline ever since the 19th century. So in order to observe regional economy in the Lower Yangzi Delta, we can rely on three key observations. One is obviously trends and movements in real wages. And the second is the wage differentials between jobs and industries. And the third key observation, which some of you here might be familiar with, is the wage premium paid over seasonal casual work. So simply speaking, these indicators reflect labor demands on different times of the year. And a premium may not exist if a person can easily find a job in any times of the year. And regarding the wage data, so in total, I managed to find 426 wage observations from local gazetteers, from official construction reports, from and even from journal articles and magazines published in the early 20th century. So for the laborers or earth diggers, I managed to find 217 observations, and in which 172 were found in Suzhou and Shanghai nowadays, and these wage points are relatively evenly distributed between 1827 and 1936. As we have explained, these wage records were mostly in piece rate, and wages paid for rush work were excluded because they were firstly very, very, very rare in record, and secondly, they were much higher than the typical wage level we managed to see in records. And because we usually have multiple wage data points for each year, so the average wage level for each year is weighted by work volume, either measured by the total earth to be dug or the number of people employed in that project. So other than these unskilled laborers, we also have wage records on bureau servants and runners. These wages were mostly in day and monthly rates, and we have 153 observations here. They mainly concentrated in the 1920s. And other than these unskilled servants and runners, we also have semi-skilled wages for dredge and marship workers, as well as hydrographic serving handymen. They were very small in numbers and mostly appeared in records in around 1920s, and they were issued in day or workday rates or monthly rates. So later on, we will be able to compare the wage gap between these unskilled and semi-skilled workers, and then analyze whether they were positive sign on the integration level of the markets in the region. Right, so let me show you the result of nominal and real wages. So here's the graph, which probably most of you are most interested about, which is the nominal day wages of 3 types of workers in $0. So one series is the unskilled diggers in the Lower Yangzi Delta as a whole. I mean, in the northern part of the Lower Yangzi, in Zhenjiang, Changzhou, Suzhou, Shanghai, and Taitung. And the second series, as we have mentioned, is the wage series for bureau servants and runners. And the last series were the wages for dredger and marship workers. And these represent semi-skilled wages. So as you can see, in $0, nominal wages had a surge by the end of the Taiping Rebellion, and then remained relatively sticky over the so-called self-strengthening movements. Then by the end of the Qing dynasty, again, real wages began to quickly surge and then eventually reached a peak by the time of the Great Depression. And these wage stickiness is even more evident if nominal day wages were measured in copper coins. And here are the results, which shows you that these wages issued in copper coins are more sticky because in records and in reality, most of the wages were actually paid in copper coins rather than $0. So in order to convert these nominal wages into real wages, we can rely on 2 different methods to measure the purchasing power of these worker wages. So one method is the daily meal basket of a farmhand in the harvest season. So the underlying assumption of this method is to estimate how many well-provisioned meal baskets can be purchased with the daily wage of a casual construction laborer. And these baskets includes is a well-provisioned basket, and it includes food, cigarette, liquid, and even tea. And the way we settle the price of these baskets is by summarizing the survey evidence from many records, and eventually we can presume that by 1928 this basket is around $0.4 per day. And the other method we can use to convert real wages is the well-known welfare ratios. So here I followed Alan's methods in the 2001 paper, and also my reconstructed consumption basket in another paper. So the underlying assumption for this method is to hypothesize whether a man working 250 days a year to support a family of 3, which includes 2 adults, 1 children, and 1 elderly, at the bare-bone level of consumption, or in other words, at a subsistence level of consumption. The higher the welfare ratios, the more a worker's wage can sustain the family consumption at this subsistence level. And here's a graph summarizes the exchange rates we use to convert different currencies, and also the price level for our price series, which also extends the basket which is mentioned in the previous slides to a time series. So here, the point I want to mention is in a ideal scenario, we would like to have only a price index for the rural retail prices. But unfortunately, we only managed to find rural retail price from Wujing County between 1913 and 1933 or 32. So for the early periods, we have to rely on other price series. And here I took a reference from Peng and Xiang's price series. So from these two prices were firstly able to extend the consumption baskets into a time series, and secondly, we're able to observe the long-term fluctuations in terms of real wages. So here's the result. As you can see, again, we have, well, simply speaking, two series. One series is measured by the general price index in the Lower Yangzi, which comes from Peng and Xiang's construction of the prices. And the other series is measured in welfare ratios. But regardless of the daily meal basket method or the welfare ratios approach, the pattern is clear. That you can see towards the opium war or towards the middle of the 19th century, real wages were slowly declining towards the subsistence level. But with the end of the Taiping Rebellion, there have been a surge, a significant improvement in real wages, and wages remained high until the last days of the Qing dynasty. So to summarize this pattern, we can simply look at the periods between 1827 to 1908, which I would argue is still a typical decline and rebound cycle, which is the same wage pattern we have observed for the early modern economies. And that means any improvements in real wages were usually accompanied with a fall in prices, rather than saying that wages going up faster than price increases. So to give you a general idea, so the graph here is from my previous research, which shows you that real wages, wouldn't be able to sustain in the long term and eventually decline over time. And by the time of 1840, we are able to observe a similar level of real wages, either from a larger data sample or from the raw labor data sample here in this paper. And for the second period, it begins to show a lot of significant differences. So for this period, I would argue it marks the onset of what we call modern intensive growth, in which case wage improvements indeed sustained and outpaced price increase, especially considering the periods 1916 to 1931, where there was a rapid growth in prices, not just in China as a whole, but also in the Lower Yangzi Delta. And this sign of intensive growth is most evident after 1926, which aligns with the so-called golden decades of the nationalist government in Beijing. And because we have these different patterns, I would argue that these set apart wage growth in the early 20th century from the patterns we observed in the early periods, whether that's the early 19th century or even the earlier time from the 17th to the 18th centuries. All right, so that's about wage movements. And now let's have a look at the labor market integration in terms of wage differentials and wage premium we have just mentioned. So here's the graph showing you the results of the wage gaps between unskilled and semi-skilled workers in the Lower Yangzi Delta. So this gray or brown line measures the wage gap between diggers and dredger workers in our data sample. So because these workers were all responsible for digging the earth, so they were essentially the same type of workers, but because dredger workers were has the requirement to operate the machines and dredgers, so I classify them as semi-skilled rather than unskilled. Therefore, in this case, what we see is a declining wage gap between unskilled and semi-skilled workers, which I would argue is another sign of further labor market integration in this period. And as a comparison, I also calculated the wage gap between diggers from this data set, and also the textile workers, especially female textile workers employed in Shanghai factories. And that is presented in this black line here. And again, we managed to observe a declining wage gap between rural unskilled laborers employed in the construction works and urban, whether you call it semi-skilled or skilled workers employed in modern types of factories. So these declining gaps, either between unskilled and semi-skilled or between rural and urban workers, shows that there was a further integration of the labor market in the Lower Yangzi Delta, at least by the early 20th century. And the other way we can observe about local market and the economy is to look at the casual wage premium we have just mentioned. So this wage premium measures the wage compensation that a worker would request in case of job riskiness and idleness in other times when he or she is not employed in the work. So simply speaking, laborers engaged for short-term work would expect higher pays compensated for job insecurity during the periods of idleness. And these premium then can be measured by the daily wages divided by year-long stable wages. So here, our unit of comparison is firstly the construction wages, and secondly, stable farm wages, which I converted into day rates using the assumption of 330 days of working year. And in order to examine whether there was any difference there's any wage difference in this wage premium in different local economies, we can again refer to different locations. So for example, for Wuxi County, it was already an industrialized local economy by the time of the 1920s and 30s, in which case 76% of farm families had unskilled work as subsidiary incomes, and the non-farm income sources accounted for 40% of the total family income. And that figure tells you, peasant families and households in this county is highly integrated into the modern industrialized economy. In comparison, we can also measure this wage premium in regions which were still largely agricultural, and that includes the case of Decline and Yuyao County. And it shows you the results. So I know you might wonder what we can tell from these, moving lines, right? So and that's exactly right. We don't actually observe any clear and significant patterns regarding the wage premium paid over casual work, whether that was in the already industrialized counties such as Wuxi or still agricultural counties like Decline and Yuyao. So in certain years, the day wage of a construction laborer was higher than the stable farm wages, which shows that there might be a risk premium for job insecurity. But in certain other years, the day wage of construction laborer was even lower than stable farm wages. So my explanation to that is that unclear pattern of wage premium paid over casual work shows that peasants in the Lower Yangzi Delta have been frequently and previously engaged in casual work during the time of agricultural off-seasons. And also noticing that these yearly stable farm wages were actually forced at the lower end of wage scale in Chinese farms. So these stable farm wages don't represent some kinds of high wage paid for the Chinese peasants. On the very contrary, they represent the lower end of farm wages. But even if that was the case, we don't actually find a consistent pattern in which construction day work were consistently paid higher than those lower end farm works on the Chinese farms. And when this wage ratio is around 1, which means there was no wage difference between short-term unstable job and a long-term stable employment, the implied length of working year is around 315 days to 340 days, which this implied number of working length is consistent with the survey result from Buck's survey, which is around 300 to 330 days per year in general. So a comparison of this casual work and stable work pace actually confirms the long working year for the majority of Chinese laborers ever since the early 19th century. And so we can probably draw some further implications on the great divergence debates using these results. So to conclude, well, I will conclude, this presentation in 3 questions. So the first question is, was the Chinese economy in secular decline? And obviously, as we have seen, the answer is no, at least in the Lower Yangzi Delta. So regarding wage movements, we have been able to observe 2 phases of local economies in the region. So the first phase is still a typical decline and rebound cycle where wage improvements occurred immediately following the devastation of the regional population and the fall in prices after the Taiping Rebellion. And then in the second phase, that's the time when at least the regional economy began to show the signs of more intensive growth, where wage movements in the region have departed from the typical decline and rebound cycle. And the second question we want you to answer is, did the state play a repressive role on the labor market? And then again, as we have shown, the answer is no. So market mechanisms predominantly determine wage setting mechanisms. And firstly, we can see that the timing of construction works can tell us that these projects were intentionally commenced during the agricultural off-season to avoid labor shortage. And secondly, workers can resort to strikes when wages were perceived by them as too low. And from many other cases, we have also seen that a large number that the government had to make a quick adjustment in response to fluctuations in market prices to retain workers on site. Otherwise, they would either run away or went on a strike if they consider wages were unfair. So the last question I want to draw a conclusion about is whether there was any non-farming employment opportunities in this region. And again, the answer is there were abundant non-farming working opportunities. So I think that the main takeaway from this conclusion is that we have perhaps to reevaluate the economic rationality of Chinese peasants, because the wage movements evidenced in these projects clearly illustrates an active casual work labor market for rural laborers in regions in the Lower Yangzi Delta during this period. And therefore, we should not perceive these Chinese peasants, particularly those in the Lower Yangzi Delta, as self-sufficient producers who were isolated from the labor market. Okay, so yeah, I think we're just about to finish this presentation. And yes, thank you very much, everybody, for the listening. And I very much looking forward to the discussion later on, and also the questions from the audience online here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ziang. So we are now inviting our discussant, Professor Peng Kaixiang from Wuhan University, to discuss for about 15 minutes. So today we will try bilingual. So Kaixiang will discuss in Chinese to better meet the audience in terms of the many China-specific terms. 彭凯翔教授将用中文来点评这篇文章，而且这篇文章是一篇关于非常具体的中国经济史的内容，所以说，我觉得大家肯定会喜欢。好，凯翔，请你来点评。
非常感谢志成，也谢谢子航的分享。那我现在就共享一下我的屏幕。可以看到吗？
可以，可以。
啊，好的。因为我用中文讲，所以我的 PPT 我就用英文做的。好，首先呢，我觉得子航这个研究是关于一个经典问题的非常重要的研究。我觉得这个研究有几方面的贡献，一个是这个议题本身是非常经典的，就是关于整个长19世纪，或者说从19世纪到20世纪前期，中国经济到底是它的发展趋势是怎么样的？ 在国内的学者有的时候会说它是发展还是不发展，所以这是一个讨论很长时间的问题。然后在国外的学者可能有像内卷化、河道加州学派之争，所以我想这个议题本身很重要。然后要讨论这样的议题，就涉及到怎么样去测度传统前现代中国经济的问题。那子昂这篇文章其实很大程度上是做一个基础性的工作，就提供扎实的数据来帮助我们进行更好的测度。所以我觉得这种研究也是非常值得鼓励的，也是现在我们比较缺乏的，就是比较扎实的通过微观的数据，然后来帮助我们做一些宏观的测度。那在数据方面呢，我觉得子昂这个研究呢，其实提供了一个很新的一个工资数据，特别是对于江南而言，我觉得尤其有意义。可能有的同仁会觉得江南研究的人很多了，特别是经济史学家研究江南，无论国内还是国外都是一个热点问题。但是呃，可能有些同仁想不到的是，江南的资料其实并不是像想象的那么丰富。江南比较好的史料是在像地方志啊、文集啊以及普迪啊这样的材料，但是民间的经济材料其实不是太多。所以最基本的，例如说工资数据，江南的工资序列是很难拉出来的。所以以前我们讨论江南经济，要讨论到工资或者收入的问题的时候，往往是用的民国的调查，然后再回溯到19世纪甚至更早时期。所以从这个意义上来说，子昂提供的这个数据对于我们讨论江南经济而言，其实是非常重要的。至少我觉得，子昂做了一个新的尝试吧。让我们看到从一个新的数据来理解江南经济，而江南可能是中国和到西方比较的时候，我们最经常拿出来的一个样本。所以我觉得这个数据本身是非常重要的。当然，用这个工资数据呢，子昂不仅仅是想用它来测度一下这个生活水平啊，或者说这个国民收入的一般性的变化，还用它来讨论当时中国的这个劳动力市场。甚至我觉得这篇文章可能对水利史的研究，包括对赋役史的研究也会有意义，因为这里面涉及到怎么样理解这个赋役的价格的问题，所以这个是江南水利史里面也会经常讨论到的问题，所以我觉得这篇文章可能会有多方面的贡献。呃，当然，我觉得如果要去讨论这个文章的逻辑的话，我觉得可能还有几个地方，可以再进一步还有进一步探讨的余地。那么就像子昂这个题目所说的一样，子昂呢试图想通过工资数据呢来探讨这个近代的整个经济趋势的问题。但是呢，我觉得这个时间段的经济趋势去讨论它的话，有一些大的背景，或者说有不同的因素是夹杂在一起的，这可能会使得我们在解读工资数据的时候，可能需要小心。例如说，我们都知道，在19世纪中期，太平天国带来了很大的人口损失，所以当我们如果发现，在1860年之后，如果用实际工资，我们看到的情况没有那么悲观，例如说长期来看，实际工资甚至有所上升，那它的意义到底是什么？它是构成了对内卷化或者马尔萨斯理论的一个拒绝吗？好像很难这样说，因为它是人口减少之后我们所看到的情形，所以它的意义好像既很难用来支持内卷化，也很难用来反对内卷化，这是我的一个感觉。然后另外一个呢，就是子昂试图去讨论当时整个的用工资数据来讨论当时的农村收入的问题。那我想当时的一般意义上的国民收入里面有相当一大部分是来自于农业。那当时我们从工资上面可能会看到，比如说在1930年前后有一个比较大的上升。如果从图上来看，大概是28年到31、32年的样子，我们会看到上海以及苏州它的这个实际工资上升比较快。但是呢，在这个时期，如果我们去看农业收入，也就是来自农产品的收入，可能会是另外一个情形。比如说在，整个19世纪中国的农产品的话，在茶、在蚕桑、 这些产业上都受到了很大的国际竞争。那茶的话，从19世纪末20世纪初开始，它可能就有点走向一个衰退。蚕丝的话稍微晚一点，蚕丝的话到19世纪20年代末30年代初，它开始也感到很大压力。然后棉纺织业也受到了一些影响。所以在这种情况下，怎么样去评价？从20年代末到30年代，这段时间实际工资上升，我看刚才马老师在评论区也提了一个问题，就觉得好像，有点奇怪。那我想，可能在实际工资那里，即使我们看到一个上升，但是在农业收入那里，如果我们看到是一个下降的话，那整个收入合起来，它会是一个什么样的情况？那实际上，在农村除了农业收入的话，还有副业收入。那农村的副业收入的话，那可能在20、30年代受的影响可能更大。例如说棉纺织业的话，棉花种植受的影响没有那么大，但是土布纺织业它肯定是受的影响很大的。所以这整个合起来、综合起来，如果我们要去看当时近代的中国经济的长期变迁的话，那可能和仅仅看这个工资数据看到的，可能还是会有点不一样。那我明白子昂的逻辑，是因为在这些收入里面，至少我们说这个雇佣工资它是其中的一个部分，我们可以从这个部分来看它的一个变化。但是如果说工资这部分反映的变化和其他部分的变化刚好是相反，或者会互相抵消的时候，那这时候我觉得这个讨论可能就要稍微要小心一点。这是我觉得就是说，如果我们要去判断整个呃19世纪到20世纪初的这个经济变化的情形的时候，可能需要注意的地方。然后另外一个问题就是说，子昂实际上很仔细的讨论了怎么样进行测度的问题，怎么样去测度当时劳动者收入。那子昂区分了这个日工资、年工资，甚至我看有的时候也提出了这个家庭工资的这样一个概念。那我觉得这个区分其实是非常有必要的。那日工资和年工资的区分呢，这个在现在的关于欧洲的这个经济史的讨论里面已经讨论的比较多了，也就是我们说每年这个劳动者他的工作时长，他能够获得的就业机会可能是变化的。所以呢，日工资并不等同于年工资。所以子昂也是试图找了农业的一些年工的数据来讨论一下年工的情形。但是我觉得还有一个指标可能很重要。那这是以前黄宗智教授的研究刚进到国内的时候，很多学者就提出来的。那黄宗智教授特别强调在农业，特别是第一产业上的日均的劳动生产率。那很多学者就说，你不能只看每天的劳动生产率，你要看整个一年的整个农业周期里面你的家庭的总收入。所以在这里面有两个含义，一个呢不仅仅不能只看每天的工资，要看你作为一个农业周期的一年的工资。另外呢，因为这样一个生产过程，它是整个家庭成员在一起的，它是混合了主业和到副业的，所以没办法把主要劳动力和到这个次要劳动力把它分开。所以我们可能要看一年的全家庭的收入，可能会更有意义。而且呢，这也是在发展经济学里，我们会注意到的。那对于传统社会而言，它的消费决策是由家庭来做出来的，所以呢，影响他生活水平的更直接的指标也是作为一个家庭，它的总收入是多少。所以从这个意义上而言，可能要讨论当时的农村的经济的话，可能更有意义的指标是这个家庭层面的它的整个生产周期的收入。这个也是像李伯仲老师他一直提倡的，他和黄宗智的一些商榷，有一部分也是因为这个口径上的问题。所以一旦我们要去讨论这个家庭的年收入的话，可能我们既需要考虑男性劳动力，也需要考虑女性劳动力，还有童工，把这些都合在一起，可能才能够真的反映当时的这个劳动收入的变迁。所以我想，从指标的角度，可能我们还是要考虑一下有没有可能再进一步的进行拓展。好，然后如果说回到这个工资本身上面的话，我觉得仅仅是就工资而言，可能 我们也会看到实际工资变化存在着比较大的区域差异，然后也在不同的来源的数据里面，我们也会看到不一样的情形。比如说我自己做北京做的比较多，那我也做了北京的从19世纪初到20世纪前叶它的实际工资的变化。我觉得有几个结论和子昂的是蛮接近的，或者说反映了这两个地区的共性。一个是在整个的19世纪到20世纪前期，我们没有看到一个明显的下降。当然，在北京的话，甚至也没有看到说太平天国前后的一个下降反弹，这个也不是很明显。基本上的整个趋势呢和子昂说的比较接近。然后我们也会看到不同工种的它的实际工资，无论是它的变化是非常接近的，也就是说这里面存在着一个劳动力流动，它的市场配置呢占了一个比较重要的成分。所以这两点我觉得是和子昂所讨论的江南比较一致的。那有一个地方我觉得差别比较大，那就是从20年代后期到30年代，那这个实际工资有没有那么明显的上升？那从北京的工资来看，没有那么明显的上升，但是的确我们会看到，在20年代开始也是上升的，它顶点呢大概是在30年、31年左右，然后又掉下去。那这个变化，我觉得主要是什么带来的？主要是粮食价格的波动带来的，因为粮食价格波动很大，那么工资的波动没有粮食价格波动大，所以在这里面我们会看到北京也有类似情况，但是它不是说一个很明显的超过了前面这个时期。所以我们总的来看，北京的它只是有一些波动，随着粮价的变化，它会有一些波动，但是呢，好像没有那么明显趋势性上升。所以这个怎么去解释它？这个也是马老师我看他在提问里提到的，就是在这个时间段，江南的工资的确涨得非常快。这里面有几种可能性，一个的确就是江南那段时间，它的城市化是走在北方的前面，走在北京的前面。另外一个可能性就是说，在整个20世纪前期，我们会看到米价相对来说涨得比小麦价格它们之间的变化趋势是不太一样的，会不会也跟粮食价格有关系？所以这个我觉得可以再检查一下。另外呢，即使是在江南，我觉得可能还有其他的数据，需要进行一些比较。例如说，子昂用了一些五进的数据，那五进呢，子昂用的是五进的米价或者说它的物价数据。那五进的张理鸾他还收集了一个农工的工资数据。那如果看五进的农工工资数据的话，很明显它的变化呢。它的上升呢，远远要慢于这个物价上升，特别是慢于米价的上升。所以，如果我们去看五进的话，在20年代到30年代这段时期的话，实际上它的实际工资是下降的。它的真正上升的时间可能是在一开始在20世纪初的时候，在1910年前后，在这个10多年，五进的农工工资反而是上升比较快的。所以这个时间段呢，好像跟我们刚才看到的呢不太一样，所以这中间的差异怎么去解释它？当然，我想在这里面一个很重要的就是说，这些数据是来自于不同的来源，那不同的来源的数据有的时候会给我们很不一样的我们很不一样看到的趋势会很不一样。例如说，就华北而言，我们可以把不同类型的数据放在一起。包括子昂用到的卜凯调查，那在这里面我们会看到，像卜凯对盐山的调查，盐山应该说是卜凯调查里面做的比较多的一个地方，也是相对来说质量比较高的。但是我们去看盐山它的实际工资变化非常奇怪，所以这个实际工资基本上我觉得就是很有问题。这里面我想最重要的问题是盐山它的粮食价格变化很剧烈。其实它的工资数据是比较平的，但是粮价变化非常奇怪，所以就带来了这个实际工资的变化也会变得有的时候突然下降，有的时候有剧烈上升。所以这些问题的话，可能都需要谨慎的进行处理。所以当我们在比较不同来源的工资的时候，可能会遇到这样的问题。那具体的话，那我们怎么样来理解子昂这里面所提到的这个水利的夫役工资这样一种数据呢？那子昂所用到的这个工资数据，我想最多的其实是挑夫的数据，因为这个是在 这些水利工程里面最通常的一种工种。那这些挑夫的工资怎么样去理解它？我想，在原则上的话，这些挑河泥的这些夫役呢，它原则上应该来说是属于一种役。那他所获得的钱，原则上应该其实是一种补贴。也就是说，例如说，一个县要修水利工程，就像子昂提到的，它是按亩来计夫的。你有30亩田，你可能就要出一个夫工。所以呢，呃，它这里面有一点强制性，只是你出一个夫工的话，那如果这个水利工程是官修的话，那官方呢会给你一定补贴。所以原则上来说，这个工钱它本意应该是一种对夫役的一种补贴，所以它可能和雇佣情形下的工资可能会有一些不一样。当然，我同意子昂说的，实际上在这里存在着一个从补贴到工资的转变，或者说从夫役到雇佣的一个转变，这过程可能是渐进的。但是我的感觉就是说，好像从我听子昂讲或者看文章来看，这个转变的线条时间线好像还是不是很清晰。所以这样的话，例如说，当我们看到某段时间，特别是在很明显在20世纪初之后呢，我们会看到这个夫役的实际工资它有一个比较快的上升。那这个比较快的上升是真实的，它所对应的当时劳动力在市场上的雇佣价钱的上升呢，还是一个制度性的变化带来的。也就是说，在这时候，这种雇佣的成分呢越来越强，这种补贴呢越来越向自由市场的工资靠近，是不是这样一个转变在这里面也起了作用？所以我觉得这个可能需要更仔细的讨论。那说到这一点的话，我觉得，我在这里有一个建议，就是我看纸上引用了很多地方志的数据，但是好像没有和现有的江南水利史的文献进行一个对话。那实际上，在目前江南水利史的研究里面，有不少学者在讨论这个夫役的问题，他们可能对这个过程会讨论的更加细一点。或许我觉得可以再和这方面的文献做一些结合，例如说像中山大学的吴涛、谢石几位学者都对这方面有很多研究。我觉得有可能的话，甚至我们里面可能会找到一些线索，把这个夫役的工钱从近代再往前推，甚至推到明代。所以我觉得在这方面或许可以再做进一步的工作。然后另外，就像子昂提到的，这个夫役的工钱，它本身的口径呢，其实是一个计件工资，它是按土方来算的，然后需要把它折成一个日工资的标准。那这里面可能也涉及到标准的问题，因为土方折成日的话，有的时候差异比较大，那有的时候缺乏这个转换率的时候，我看文中提到，有的时候是按时间或者地点相近的，然后就拿相近地点的这个口径去折。这个可能有的时候会有一些差异，因为不同的这个工程当它在不同季节开工的时候，挑不同的泥的时候，它可能这个工作量实际上会不一样，所以可能仅仅用地点或者时间相邻，是不是能完全解决这个问题？可能也有一定的存疑。好，另外呢，可能还有一些其他的小问题，一个就是我们会看到这些水利的工资呢，实际上是来自于很多的方志，包括这个水利志。那它涉及到不同的地方，这地方虽然都是在江南，但是直接拿在一起的时候，这里面是不是也要小心一点？例如说，我以前觉得江南的市场整合应该比较好。但是当我仔细去看这个上海的米价和到武进的米价的时候，我就发现，上海的米价和张李鸾所提供的武进的米价相比较而言，上海的米价它基本上总是高了20%以上，所以这个差别的话，其实还是蛮大的。所以这个会不会影响我们工价的比较，无论是名义的还是实际工价比较？但这里面不仅仅涉及到米价的问题，还涉及到银钱比价的问题。所以我想，可能做这个工作的时候，我们最好要找到每个县的米价和到银钱比价进行折算，这样可能这个数据会更扎实一点。然后子昂也讨论了一些工资结构的问题，例如说提到了这个非技术工和到技术工他们之间的工资差。那子昂呢认为，在1910年代之后呢，在20世纪前期呢，存在着他们的工资差缩小的一个情形，他们工资比呢有一个趋近于1的这样一个情形。 但是这个趋近于一它代表什么？是不是趋近于一就代表劳动力市场的整合比较好？我有点存疑。因为如果说农村的劳动力越容易的进行流动的话，它应该会使得这个非熟练、非技术劳动力的工资可能会下降的更多，所以它不一定会带来这个技术溢价的缩小。所以我感觉这个意义的话，我觉得有点模糊。然后子昂还比较了这个呃水利的日工资和到农村的年工之间的工资的差异，计算了这个他们之间的一个工资溢价。那子昂发现这个工资溢价基本上是围绕着一波动，没有趋势性的变化，所以他觉得这个可能代表了一年他所工作的天数呢，可能是基本上稳定的。当然，我想这个溢价的话，它的含义也比较混合，它可能混合了这个工作长度的变化，混合了农村和到市镇或者城市之间的工资差的变化，以及季节性的变化，所以它可能三个因素混在一起的话，当我们看到这个工资溢价变化的时候，怎么去解释它，就可能需要小心，要怎么样有可能把这三者剥离开来去进行讨论。所以我觉得这个可能也是一个比较有挑战性的问题。好，我主要就是这样一些想法，跟大家讨论。谢谢。
非常感谢凯翔。那子昂你就简单先回应一下，very briefly。
我都记下来了，都记下来了。谢谢彭老师，谢谢彭老师。
所以你的回应就是都记下来了，回头再慢慢去搞。
对，因为有一些比较好解决，有一些可能受制于数据上不是好处理，所以可能回头看还是要怎么解决。但确实谢谢彭老师，很多的那个建议是很有用的。
OK
谢
OK，
谢子昂。
那再次感谢凯翔，那就我们下面就转到看一下观众的问题。因为问题基本都是英文，那我们就还是用英文。The first one, as Kai Xiang has mentioned, our Professor Debbie Ma has raised 3 questions. Okay, I will read for Zhang, okay, in order the audience can know the exact questions. Debbie asks, are these wages originally paid in dollars or coins? Did you convert them yourself? And the following question is, it's very surprising to say real wages more than doubled between 1909 and 1936. Annual per capita growth rate will be very high, 2 to 3% per year. That's quite a striking finding if that's true. And finally, these carrier wages are wages for the select reason. The fact they are not higher or no premium may not be so surprising. Okay, Zhang.
So let me show you my appendix for the first question. So this is a table where I shows how, not this one, how these figures were paid. So there are many wage numerals, including silver dollars, copper coins, silver taels, and unknown coins, and taels and coins. So, but the local numeral is very consistent, even if we don't have the full records on which currency was used. So if bigger weights were paid in copper coins and in Shanghai and Suzhou, these were paid in 9.5 standard. And if they were paid in Changzhou and Zhenjiang, they were in 9.8 standard. And also, by this principle, I was able to convert wages paid in copper coins into standard 值钱. And for other silver taels, I believe the silver taels used before the Opium War were mostly in Caoping tael rather than Kuping tael, because many financial reports frequently mentioned and counted the cost of projecting Caoping tael. So by that standard, I presume the silver, if unknown before the Opium War, were counted in Caoping tael. But other than that, other records, if we have specific numeraire in records, such as $0, then I can simply convert dollar into tael or tael into dollar using the exchange rate. For the second question, what's the second? I do have this impression that this wage increase after, especially in the Republican period, is quite astonishing. Because last week when I presented this topic at Geneva University, one of the comments was suggesting, like Kai-Sheng also mentioned, these wage improvements in the Republican period might be caused by the institutional reasons, in which case the digger wages might get even closer to the market rates instead of all attributing to the market mechanism. So yeah, I would agree. The interpretation here has to take into account further elements instead of simply saying this might just be a market reason. For the last question, there is a seasonal wage premium in the summertime for the construction works, but I excluded them from my data set. So that's why all of my wage data are in the winter or early spring season. So that gives you a not very clear pattern for the wage differentials between casual and stable work. So I believe if we take into account those very high seasonal wages, the pattern might change a little bit.
Okay, the next question from children. Can you elaborate on the administrative system's role, especially after self-strengthening movement, in making industrialization policy and pushing wage adjustment while market dynamics determine the wages? And have you ever found any difference in different skill types of workers might have different wage ratio, and therefore reflecting in workers' performance and behavior?
Okay, so for the first part of the question, the wage setting mechanism and the wage formation largely remains the same over this entire period, whether that was in the late Qing period or early Republic periods. So I, at least for my record side, I don't see there was a significant change in the wage setting mechanism after the industrial policy was introduced. And for the second part of the question, sorry, let me see. Have you found a difference in different skill types? Oh, I think this difference in skills or working efficiency is mostly reflected in piece rates. So because diggers were mostly paid in piece rates, if an individual worker had better performance, that might be reflected in his day rates. But in general, I do manage to find some academic studies published in the 1920s and 30s showing that the average working efficiency for a construction site is around, diggers, is around 0.7 farm of earth per day. So that's why 0.6 to 0.7. So that's why I took a reference on this. You can either say standardized working efficiency to convert this large sample into a day rate. But regarding the individual wages per day or individual working efficiency, that can be different.
Okay, this audience has a follow-up question. Let me read it for you. Additionally, there's a quick question. How could you find this data and combine all these data sets together? It seems that you use many original data sets. Okay, you can refuse to share your experience. That's your secret.
Yeah, I will share my final results when this paper is published. But regarding the specific source of this data, I would say it's a very diverse source, and it takes a lot of time to collect data from them.
Or you can say, please refer to my appendix of the paper. Yeah, thanks. Anyway, the next question from Jacqueline Velasco. thank you for the presentation. I would like to know to what extent women were involved into non-agricultural income-generating activities.
It's hard to say. I mean, for certain periods like 1920s and 30s, or even 40s, we do have occasional survey data available for certain large mega cities like Shanghai, Tianjin, or Wuhan. But for other periods, for the most majority of the periods and the most majority of the cities and the rural areas, we lack these kind of direct evidence. But what I can say is it really depends. There was a north and south difference, and also regional difference. So as to say to what extent women were involved, I don't have a definite answer to this. But in certain regions, women can participate in the labor market very frequently. But in some other regions, that might not be the case.
Thanks. The last question from Daniel Ho. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very useful. I want to ask, the outflow of silver may cause inflation, and whether or not this inflation would affect your statistical results. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Suzhou. That's a very quick real-time translation. So, generally speaking, I mean, the elements that causing nominal wage to rise has a lot of reasons. This silver outflow could be one of the reasons, but because I try to focus on the trends without over-interpret why it moves up or down. So I would say I think this could be one of the reasons, but we need further tests, especially regression analysis, to decide how much this silver outflow or inflow has an impact on the level of nominal wages.
Well, sorry, another question just came in from Catherine Barnes. A few questions about an average worker's family budget. Were women and the children paid the same as men? One slide shows an average household as having one child and one elder. Were women during the time of the study having only one child? Did they join the men on site to share a shed and a meal? Also, I would be curious whether women could plan conception to align with most profitable times to work. If so, could the data about the months or timing of babies point to relative value of work?
That's a very interesting question. From my background knowledge, what I can tell you is that men and women are not paid at the same level. For example, in the case of textile factory workers in Shanghai, women are generally paid only half to male workers' wage level. As regarding the family size, that's why I explain in detail the underlying assumption about the welfare ratio. So yes, in reality, Chinese family size should be much larger than that, rather than just 3, maybe 5 or 6. But in order to be consistent with the previous literature, especially the literatures on the global wage comparisons, I adopted that approach only as a theoretical foundation in order to make our results comparable in terms of real wages. And lastly, I'm afraid I don't have data on that part. I wish I do, but I mean, if one day I were able to find these detailed data, I will definitely update with you with the latest result. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all the audience for your questions. Lastly, Professor Chen, do you have any comments now?
Oh, okay. Yeah, Zhicheng, thank you. So, one of the things I kept wondering about while I listened to your talk is, to what extent you can really draw conclusions about longer term trends in income and wages for China when the period you focus on is so special, as Kai-Xiang pointed out, you know. So after the Opium War, right? So many, you know, new technologies and new ways of business organization came to China. So that led to a more disruptive or destructive changes to the industries and to the economic structure. And then also in the early 20th century, especially after the 1910s, like all the way up to the end of your period of research, you know, there were wars going on. So, I mean, how much energy and time could the officials in the Republican government really have to regulate the labor market, regulate the economy when they were facing all the constant threats from the you know, the Communist Party troops and so on. How much real spare time would they have to really try to mess up the economy and so on? So, I mean, all these background factors must have played a big role. And then one other thing is, I know many people who work in this area just keep focused on Jiangnan, on the most developed, most marketized, and most commercialized region of China. Kai-Xiang is from Jiangxi, from the countryside, and I'm also from the countryside in Hunan. Even by the time I was growing up in the rural village, the level of marketization or commercialization of the economic lives and incomes were so low. So trying to figure out income levels, I mean, by far, most of the incomes, so to speak, would be all intangible, not really handled, settled, using any real monetary instruments, whether we're talking about copper coins or paper money, you know, just there was not that much money being used on a day-to-day basis, whether we're talking about income or, you know, living the day-to-day lives for food and other things. When even, of course, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. In those days, I would hardly need to use any money for anything. You know, everything was just done without money. Of course, in the 1920s, 30s, that was before the PRC. So maybe the level of monetization and marketization of the day-to-day lives in China's countryside were probably somewhat higher than during the 1960s and 70s. But I don't imagine that to be that much higher. Anyway, so I just want to caution that we don't want to draw too many conclusions about the way of life in China, that the whole country, just by using experience and data from the Yangtze River Delta region, you know, the most developed region. I mean, anyway.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Zhang, please go ahead.
No, I was just about to say, you know, this is a very classic issue for measuring early modern Chinese history, because whether you are looking at the you know, the market price of laboring or certain other commodities, or whether you are looking at the market value of laboring, that's two different ways of thinking, right? So market price could be simply wages or the products you sold on the markets. I mean, your farming incomes and then turn into monetary incomes. But on the other hand, you know, what I'm trying to do in this paper is, even though I was showing the wage evidence, but I was trying to see whether this wage evidence can represent the market value of laboring, which in turn, if it can, then it can tell us something about, you know, rural working pattern, laboring and seasonality, etc. So yes, I think that I would love to have more regional data outside of the Lower Yangzi, but even for the Lower Yangzi, it's very difficult to manage to find data. But in the future, my plan is to see whether we can find further evidence outside Jiangnan, especially in the vast rural inland regions. But yeah, thank you very much for the comments.
Yeah, also very quickly, you know, just to add to the question and then your comment on women, whether they would take non-farming jobs, and also whether they would share a shed or a meal with men when they were working outside the home and so on. Just for some background knowledge, I know many of you, you know, are too young and or grew up in a big cities, so you would not know what life was like in the traditional Chinese countryside. Just to say that for me, from my personal experience, my mother would never want to sit at a dinner table or lunch table with the rest of us in the family, my father and my brothers, or especially when we had guests. Because in the Chinese countryside, women were not supposed to join any meal with men, especially with guests, strangers from outside the family. So what I'm trying to say is that for my mother, you know, I would never imagine her being willing to work outside their home, either as a hired labor for something or not, because anyway, so I think that kind of a traditional practice, especially in the Chinese countryside, that information, that knowledge now is very much lost among young scholars who do research on Chinese agriculture, especially the agrarian way of life in traditional China, because all those customs and practices, for people who grew up or grow up in cities nowadays across China, I mean, such practice would be just such strange thing to know. But anyway, so maybe before I formally retire, I should have more students just to tell everyone what I observed in terms of how my mother, my grandmother, and others I grew up with lived their way of life. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you so much. But actually, we just received a question from our colleague, Professor Yuan Wei Peng, but it's two good questions. But given we are running out of time, we have to skip your question, Professor Wei Peng. 放心，子昂已经记下来了。OK， 回头再跟你解释。Thank you again, Professor Kai Xiang, for your discussion, and thank you, Zhang, for your presentation. So let me announce our next event scheduled for the next week. We are very happy to invite Professor Hu Sijie from Economics School of Renmin University of China to introduce her study on the intergenerational transmission of reproduction and human capital in mixing Chinese family. We very much look forward to that. Okay, thank you again. See you next week.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
再见，拜拜。